Welcome to Love Thy Lawyer, where we talk to attorneys about their lives and careers. I'm Louis Goodman. Today, we welcome Thomas Dunlap to the podcast. Tom is a founding partner of Dunlap, Bennett, and Ludwig. Started in 2001, it has grown into an internationally recognized venture with over 80 attorneys and 14 locations across the United States and the United Kingdom. Mr. Dunlap has substantial experience in business, corporate, intellectual property, and government contract litigation. He's been featured on major media outlets, including CBS, Fox, and NPR. He is himself a podcast host, fronting the Black Letter podcast. And, perhaps most impressively, he served for 9 years in the United States Army, where he rose to the rank of company commander. Tom Dunlap, welcome to Love Thy Lawyer.
Thanks, Louis. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure to have you. Where are you speaking to us from right now?
So I'm in the D.C. metro area, about 35 minutes outside of Washington, in a town, regional town in Loudoun County near Dulles called Middleburg.
Can you describe in your words what kind of a practice you have?
So my individual personal practice is principally intellectual property. It involves some prosecution work. It involves litigation, it involves licensing, transactions, and government contracts. The firm's practice includes M&A and real estate and estate planning and a few other areas, pretty much most of the things that touch and concern business. We have an immigration partner that does H-1B visas. So the firm's pretty broad, but my practice in particular is IP and government contracts.
You started the firm in 2001, and as I mentioned in the intro, it's now quite large. Can you tell me how it got so big so quickly?
Well, it's been 23 years, so it didn't happen over the 23 years. The first 5 or 6 years, my only law partner was Dan, and Dan and I were both still in the reserves and guard. And if you'll recall, we went to war with almost everybody at that time. And so we were both stop-lost. I was a cavalry officer and Dan was a 20th Special Forces Group officer. So we took turns deploying, sometimes at the same time. So the first 6 years of the practice was, just being in the Army while sort of having a law practice. And then it really took off after I went back to school and got my MBA and made some very intentional decisions about how to build the practice and what I wanted out of a law practice. And that was about 2012, 2014, when we kind of turned that corner.
Where are you from originally?
Sort of all over. I was born in New Jersey, lived in Texas until I was 8, then moved to Northern Virginia, Great Falls, and then went to high school. We moved to London and Switzerland, came back here for college outside of Manhattan in Pennsylvania, and then now I'm back here after law school.
How is it that you traveled around so much?
My father's job. He moved for a company called Arthur Andersen, and so he moved a lot, at least initially back then. They didn't have Teams or Zoom, so he had to be there.
When you went to college, where did you go? You said you went outside of New York.
Yeah, I went to Lafayette College. I'm actually a professor there now. I teach a 4-credit class called Intellectual Property for Scientists and Engineers in the School of Mechanical Engineering. So it's kind of neat to be back at my college as a professor. My kids don't go there. My daughter's at Brown and my son is still in high school. I'm hoping he'll look at Lafayette, but we'll see.
Well, how was your experience at Lafayette? Probably pretty good since you ended up going back there.
I love the college. I think it's a great school. I know it's principally an engineering school, but I was a liberal arts major back in the day. I think it's a great school. I love it. Has a deep connection with the Marquis de Lafayette on his grand tour of the United States after the Revolutionary War. Attended the opening of the college, and that was named after. It's kind of neat. It's got a cool history. So it's an old school.
When you graduated from Lafayette, you ultimately went to law school. Did you take any time off between college and law school, or did you go straight through?
So I went to Manhattan, worked at Chemical Bank, which is now JP Morgan Chase, for a year. And then I worked at Bank of New York for a year and loved living in the city and working there. It was just a lot to do. So I kind of took a break and went to law school at Washington and Lee.
Back in Virginia.
Much quieter than Manhattan.
Yeah, that's really a kind of small town world, isn't it?
Yeah, Lexington, Virginia. Yeah.
How much time did you take off between college and law school?
It was 2 years.
Do you think having that 2-year period of being off and working, in financial industry essentially helped you kind of focus when you got to law school?
It gave me a huge appreciation for education and how much better it was than having a job. And law school was kind of fun. I know not everybody says that, but I had a lot of fun in law school and did fine. So yeah, it gave me a really good appreciation for how valuable it is to be a student.
And then what was it that prompted you to join the military, and how did that all fit in with your education and your law practice?
I worked as a prosecutor first.
Where did you do that?
Norfolk, Virginia. So I really loved the people there, and I had an offer there. But I ended up working for a private firm for about a year, I guess. And I felt like I wasn't doing anything useful. So I quit and I enlisted in the Army as a private. And I went to Fort Benning infantry school. And at the end of infantry school, I didn't ask. I was asked if I wanted to go to OCS. And then I went to OCS and went to armor school and did that whole thing. So I kind of had my wife calls it my early midlife crisis. I was like 26. Yeah, I just quit law and enlisted in the Army. So yeah, my parents thought it was a problem too. But I got a lot out of the Army, honestly.
My dad got drafted into the United States Army at the age of 35 in 1942. And he had been practicing law for 10 years at that time.
Did he get drafted as a JAG?
No, he got drafted as a private. He ultimately left the Army as a master sergeant in the military police and did have some experience in the JAG Corps. And, it was during World War II, so things were moved very, very quickly in those days. And yeah, as a matter of fact, they wanted him to stay on and give him a commission to be on the defense team for the Japanese war criminals. But he turned it down because he wanted to come home to New York.
I kind of get that.
But he always wanted me to go into the Army. He thought it was one of the really great experiences of his life.
I told my son the same thing, but I've told him not necessarily to go to the Army because I was in a lot of mud and dirt, and everybody I knew that was in the Navy or the Air Force had pretty good, generally speaking, experience, a little bit different experience, living conditions. So if you have to pick, unless you really want to be in the mud, then go be in the mud.
Well, I guess it takes all kinds.
Yeah, fair enough.
I want to ask you a little bit about the business of practicing law, because you have not only had a successful law practice, but you've, as we discussed a little bit earlier, really have built a very good business in your law practice. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that's gone for you and what your expectations around that were and how that's come out.
That was really a very intentional decision. So right now, our firm has a CEO, we have a CTO, a CMO, and a CFO. All of these people, Deanna's our CEO, Amy, Jeff, and Rob, and Doug, none of them are lawyers. Our CFO is a CPA, our CEO is a former VP from Airbus, our CMO is a former VP of marketing from Merck. So we hired professionals to do the business. Lawyers, it's like flying airplanes and doctors, right? You're not good at everything just because you're good at one thing. Just because you're smart and you went to law school or medical school doesn't mean you weren't trained to run a business. So I went back to school and got my MBA. And a lot of my final projects for that, since the other students didn't really care what we picked, were around how do you structure and run a law firm? What's the best use of an attorney's time? And not shockingly, the best use of an attorney's time is getting clients and using their legal degree to do law, as opposed to look at malpractice renewal or photocopier contracts or HR stuff. That's not really your job as a lawyer. So that's a lot of the ethos that I base our firm around. And I think it makes for happy lawyers because they don't have lawyers on committees about, well, where should we put this desk? Or we have professionals who do it who are unbiased and who aren't looking at it for the benefit of their particular practice area or their little fiefdom. A lot of law firms aren't fun places. And so we really want to work at a law firm we like going to. And a lot of part of it, a lot of it's culture, a huge part of it, but part of it is also not having lawyers do things that they're not necessarily great at. So that's a lot of how we build our practice. Happy lawyers make good lawyers.
I know that you're involved in intellectual property. I'm wondering what's going on with artificial intelligence. Everywhere I turn, I run into somebody talking about artificial intelligence. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what your experience with it is and where your practice fits in with that.
We deal with it a lot. In fact, one of my good buddies, tennis buddy, is a counsel at RIAA, Recording Industry of America. And he said it's 95% of his job now is dealing with AI, because AI can take anything and make anything and bake anything. And the challenge we have in the intellectual property space, especially in the patent space and the technical space, is AI is now working with inventors to develop things. AI is creating things that are I can't remember her name, but a woman just won a book prize in Japan. And she admitted that like a third of her book was written by AI. And she said she intends to keep using it. But where it stands from a legal perspective. So right now, artificial intelligence cannot own a patent and they cannot create patentable subject matter. The USPTO has come down very strongly on that and said, you can use AI to make a patent, to invent, but a human has to be the input end and the output end. And it has to have human attachment to it. It has to be a human invented thing because artificial intelligence can't do that. What's interesting is there's a fella who had AI invent something. So if you write a book using AI and say you drew the pictures, this is the most recent and famous case that the US Copyright Office puts out there. A woman wrote a book and she used AI, I think DALL-E, to create the pictures in her graphic novel. And the US Copyright Office gave her copyright rights in her text, but no copyright rights in the images because they weren't generated by her. So AI can do a lot of things and it can help you, but you can use it as a tool. But in the IP space, you're not going to own the IP. Now, you can use it for something like ChatGPT. Hey, give me 30 interesting names for a company that sells beer. I don't know. That nobody else is using. That's a great use of AI. You can use the brands and then you have to do a trademark search and all that happy stuff. But I think that's a good use. But you have to be careful when using AI that it's not doing things that you couldn't own.
You briefly mentioned patent prosecution. And for people like myself who work primarily in the criminal law area, we see prosecution as one type of thing, but patent prosecution is something very different. I'm wondering if you could explain that a little bit.
In the IP space, we call patent prosecution and trademark prosecution the prosecution of a subject matter. Patent prosecution is the drafting of a patent application to protect an invention or an idea. So it's not prosecution in the traditional sense, like what I did back in the day, putting people in jail, or what you do, defending people, keeping people out of jail. It's putting a patent into the USPTO and getting it issued or getting a trademark filed and registered from the USPTO. That's all it means in that context.
What's your experience in dealing with the government on government contracting and essentially dealing with the government as a business?
We have a significant practice that represents government contractors. And so the government, any agency you can think of off the top of your head, will put out a request for a proposal. Company will bid on it. We deal with bid protests, teaming agreements, getting qualified before the SDA as a small business or woman-owned or SDVOSB, any of the things that you need in the government space. And there's a lot of it here, not surprisingly, around Washington, D.C. Probably heard the term Beltway bandits. Well, there's a lot of Beltway bandits are our clients, and they do a lot for the government that supports our country and not just defense. One of our biggest clients is Health and Human Services. We as a law firm are a government contractor ourselves to Health and Human Services for all their external IP needs through NIH, NIH's Office of General Counsel. Right? It's mostly for trademark work, but they can ask us IP things by a contract. So NIH's Office of General Counsel, this is generally how most government contracts will work. We bid, we won the contract. They'll give us a project. We'll give them a cost for the contract. It's inside of the quote that we gave them back in the day when we bid on it a year or two ago. And then they'll issue a purchase order and we'll file a trademark or do a trademark search or, well, do a trademark trial and appeals board case, whatever it is.
You are also a podcast host. And of course, that interests me. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you do on that.
Sure. Yeah. The Black Letter podcast is in its third year, I think. We have some 30 something thousand downloads. It's principally a sort of like your podcast, but it doesn't go into lawyers' careers. It goes into business people's problems and experiences. So usually what I do is my guests are, I've had the chief counsel of the FAA, but I've also had, guys who started a real estate broker business that they grew to 200 people. So it's kind of like you, but it's kind of on the business side of things. And my format is more, tell us a little bit about where you come from. That's 2 or 3 minutes of the show, not the whole show. And then the bulk of the show is tell us about a challenge you faced and give us advice for people who want to do what you do. If I wanted to start a brewing company or a distillery, everybody can imagine on the show. Give us advice about that. And then every Monday, I have a Monday Morning Minute, which is really 2 to 5 minutes. And it's usually about either something esoteric in law that I found interesting that week or something that's really relevant. Like the last 2 weeks, I did a Monday Morning Minute on the FTC's ban on non-competes and the Chamber of Commerce's lawsuit against the FTC, which is a huge deal for everyone in the United States, whether you know it or not. If something's big, I'll talk about that.
What do you think's the best advice you've ever received? And kind of the other half of that is, what advice would you give to a young attorney just starting out? And you could answer both or either parts of that question.
I think probably the best advice I've ever received is that you don't make money by being a lawyer. A law degree is not entree to money. You make money when you're a lawyer because you hear about things and people need you for things. And so you can get involved in things. And I know that's a weird piece of advice. I started a biotech company because somebody came to me for help, and that's been successful. And I've started other things. So you really make money because you're a lawyer, not by being a lawyer. If that makes sense.
I think that's really true. It's interesting. I've never really heard it put quite that way. And is that the advice you'd give to a young attorney starting out?
My advice to a young attorney starting out today is don't be jaded by where you work. There's so many things you can do with a law degree. Being a lawyer isn't miserable. I have a friend who's a psychologist now who was a lawyer. You can do anything with a law degree. It gives you the access to the box top. If we're all playing a board game right here, the lawyers at least read the box top no matter what you do in life. So my advice is love the fact that you were a lawyer, and whether or not you practice law, you don't have to practice law. Do what you love. That's the advice I'd give to anybody. Do what you love and you will be successful. Personally, that's my definition of success.
You obviously are someone who is very bright. You have lots of experience. You have lots of opportunities. You are a practicing attorney. What is it that keeps you as a practicing lawyer as opposed to doing one of these other possibilities?
I get a personal satisfaction out of clients, companies that do complex and interesting things. And I really enjoy helping people. I know it sounds weird as a lawyer, but helping people fix their problems and being successful for them.
I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, Tom. Can you talk a little bit about how the practice of law has fit into your family life, how your family life has fit into your practice of law? What about that kind of work-life balance thing?
Well, so my wife, when we started out, was a lawyer at a large firm. And so you probably know what that's like. Crazy hours. And I had joined the military and started deploying. We had young kids. So they were at daycare full time. It was tough at the beginning. It was a, 4 a.m. to 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. job initially, but I really took some intentional decisions to figure out how to change that. So I've kind of worked my law practice around my family so that I could be involved with them more. And, I think it's good.
What sort of things do you like to do recreationally to get your mind off of the practice of law every once in a while?
So since I've been out of the Army, I've been a big runner. I've run usually a couple marathons a year. I did triathlons for a little while. Back in 2012 was the last Ironman. So it's been a little while. And I have been a pilot for the last 20 years. I had a plane for 9. I sail. I am a master scuba diver, PADI master scuba diver. I used to do archaeology dives with a group in DC that went all over the place. It was fun. So, I hike. I travel for fun. I like drinking, white burgundies mostly, but wine, stuff like that. So,
Well, it sounds like you're a real Renaissance man in a lot of ways.
or ADHD, I think probably attention deficit is probably more likely the cause, but
What mistakes do you think lawyers make?
I think the biggest mistake that I see when I talk to lawyers, well, two mistakes. So I think some lawyers who are jerks to other lawyers are shooting themselves in the foot. I feel like that's a big mistake you're making probably with your life too, because it's probably not healthy. And then the other mistake I see as a business mistake is where a lawyer tries to be their own business person for everything. They try to do their social media. They try to do it all themselves. And their idea to grow is to hire another associate. Not realizing, I've talked to a lot of lawyers who are like, oh my God, you're right. Hiring another associate means a lot more work for you, not less work. Just because you have another body, it's a lot more work. So I see that mistake. I mean, I don't know if everybody agrees, but it seems to be pretty universally true in my experience.
Where did you kind of get this notion about getting someone to run the business for you? I mean, how did that come up?
I went back and did my MBA at night while I was still in the reserve and my kids were quite young and I was sort of running a law practice. And the last year really year and a half of that night program, at an MBA program, you do these projects. And the first project I picked was what practice area drives the most revenue and the best return for what you do and is the most interesting. And we did a practice area and consumer sensitivity study. And then the next thing I did is how are law firms inefficient? And we created a SWOT analysis for each thing that a law firm does, like how it manages money and how it manages resources and how it manages people. And the answer was that lawyers shouldn't be doing these things because the value of a lawyer's billable hour is so much more than the cost of the people who are very good at these things. I mean, it ended up being common sense, but we did a lot of charting and graphing and research to prove that it was common sense.
So it was part of this MBA project.
It was initially, yeah. I mean, obviously, as the firm grew over time, and I finished that in 2012. It was, life lessons learned. There's some good books out there. It's hard to read a book and take something from it. So some of it was just hard lessons. And each time it was a huge step. It was a huge step to convince my partners when we were a smaller firm, like, we should have somebody who's not a lawyer run the firm. And lawyers, their heads almost exploded. They're like, no, a non-lawyer can't run a law firm. They wouldn't know things. I'm like, what things? Like, I think they can figure out trust accounting if they're our CFO, which they now love, MBA, CPA, sold his company to Travelocity. He's smart. I mean, he's able to figure out trust accounting in like an afternoon. So lawyers they'll never understand that. Same with our CEO. She figured out everything a law firm does within a few months. And then now all of the partners trust her. I mean, it's just a natural thing, but that was a huge leap for lawyers mentally to think that a non-lawyer could do it. Cause since, the 1700s, the tradition of lawyers is lawyers manage other lawyers. And we're all kind of this little secret club and breaking that paradigm. I think it's going to happen more because they're publicly traded law firms now. There's one, at least in the US. And so practice rules are changing and the world is changing. And venture capital, private equity, they're getting into the law business because there's money there.
What sort of things keep you up at night?
My kids. I stress for my kids and their stress. And I don't even know why they have the stress. And we tell them not to have the stress, but the kids have the stress.
Is there anybody living or dead who you'd like to meet?
I would have loved to have met Patton because I was an armor officer and he was the most successful general of all generals on earth. I don't know. You can look this up. It's actually a fact ever. I mean, I know he's terrible to PTSD people in the hospital and that whole thing, but love to have met him. I would have loved to have met George Washington. Honestly, the man who could have been king. I know that sounds so trite. Or Marcus Aurelius. I'm a big fan of the Stoics. So I would have loved to have met him if I could have I'd have to speak Latin, I suppose. So with the translator.
Yeah, I've just started reading some of his meditations.
Yeah, it's great, right?
Yeah.
Some of them are fantastic. You're like, yeah, duh. Yeah. I have meditations by my bed. So I think it's a good book.
Let's say you had a magic wand. There was one thing in the world that you could change, the legal world or otherwise. What would that be?
What would I change? I don't know. I'd like to change. I just wouldn't want the magic wand. I think it's just, too much. There's too much I'd want to change and it's so risky. You know what? I'd wipe out cancer. That seems like a good thing.
Tom, if someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
dbllawyers.com.
So it's dbllawyers.com.
Yep. So it's DBL, 2 L's in the middle, Delta Bravo Lima, Lima Alpha Whiskey Yankee Echo Romeo Sierra.com.
Said like a real pilot. Tom, is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't touched on? Anything at all that you'd like to mention or talk about?
No, not at all. You've been very fair and fun, and you've covered everything I can think of, plus some things I haven't thought of. So thank you very much for having me on your show. Appreciate it. It was good fun.
Tom Dunlap, thank you so much for joining me today on the Love Thy Lawyer podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, you too. Thanks, Louis.
That's it for today's episode of Love Thy Lawyer. If you enjoyed listening, please share it with a friend and follow the podcast. If you have comments or suggestions, send me an email. Take a look at our website at lovethylawyer.com, where you can find all of our episodes, transcripts, photographs, and information. Thanks to my guests, and to Joel Katz for music, Brian Matheson for technical support, Paul Roberts for social media, and Tracy Harvey. I'm Louis Goodman.
I know that's not a great answer, but that's
Well, it's your answer.
Yeah, that's all I got.